This is Your Anxiety Toolkit, episode number 71.
Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go.
Well, welcome back, everybody. I am so thrilled to be with you again. I am really excited about this week's interview. Mainly because this is the final of the We Can Do Hard Things series that I did over the summer of this year, where I interviewed people who I felt were leading the way in their particular area with spreading awareness about mental illness and sharing their story and giving us hope that we too can do hard things. Now, this was a really serendipitous interview because Michael Schlossberg, who is our interviewee this week, reached out to me and said, I feel like your community really lines up with the same mission that I have and that I'd love to be on the show if you're interested. And I'm so glad that he did because he brings a very interesting perspective to advocacy work. And he really does show the bravery of talking to others about mental illness. Now, the reason that I say that is that Michael Schlossberg, if you haven't heard of him, is the state representative for the state of Pennsylvania. He is an advocate, and he's the author of the fiction book Redemption, which references mental health quite a lot. And the work that he does is all related to mental health and mental health services. So I was really excited to speak with Representative Schlossberg on this issue because he talks openly about his experience with severe depression. He talks openly about his experience with anxiety and even suicidal ideation, which I think is three topics that, as far as I know, we don't talk about in politics and we don't bring up. And while this interview isn't any political stand, I don't want anyone to feel like this is a political interview at all. What I really enjoyed was just seeing someone in a sector, right, an industrial sector or in a career sector who has gone against the grain and spoken out about struggles with mental illness. I think that, it's the same with people in the entertainment industry. How rare it is for people to actually put their hand up and say, I'm really having a hard time with mental illness. I think we're getting better, but we still have a long way to go. I think that even in the therapy realm, it's still so hard for therapists to put their hands up and say, I'm struggling, right? For any professional, I think we still live in a world where raising your hand and asking for help can be seen as a weakness. And I just love how Representative Schlossberg discusses mental illness and discusses in the interview about his process of quote unquote coming out. He references his coming out as a response to the Robin Williams suicide, right? And I can remember that day, I'm sure you can too, of just being so sad and in shock and in such grief over the death of Robin Williams. And he talks about how that was a piece or an event where he decided that he had to speak out and he had to respond to some of the misconceptions people have about depression and about suicide and about mental illness in general. So I'm so thrilled. He is really great at talking about Even just the statistics, bringing up really important points like 1 in 5 Americans have depression, and 1 in every 2 people will have depression at some point in their life. And so for me, it was really, really helpful just to have someone be so open and also discuss how they've used their own mental illnesses or mental struggles towards a creative outlet, like writing a book. That's just really cool to me. I'm inspired by that. I feel like if we could use our mental illness and if you choose to, put it towards a story or some kind of creative project that you're working on, I think that's a really wonderful way to work through our own pain and talk about our pain and feel seen and heard. So I'm just going to move straight over to the interview. I hope you enjoy it. And I am really going to look forward to hearing what you have to say. All right. Have a wonderful day. And here's the interview. Well, welcome everybody. Today I am so delighted to have Michael Schlossberg with us.
Hello.
Hi. And
Hi, thank you very much.
Of course. Michael is an author and an advocate for mental health, and he is the Pennsylvania state official representative. So we have ourselves here an incredible mix of advocacy, and it's actually really, really quite inspiring. So I love that. You reached out. I know that you have so much to share and so many good things to discuss. Share with me a little bit about why you do what you do.
Sure. Well, so I do have an interesting mix of professions. My full-time job, my primary job is to be an elected official. I'm a state representative in Pennsylvania. I represent about 65,000 people in the Pennsylvania state legislature. I live in the city of Allentown, which is primarily the area that I represent. Two biggest issues to me are education and mental health. And the mental health one is the one that I talk about the most frequently. It's probably my big calling card issue, my biggest passion. And I come at that from two perspectives. The first is policy-based. So 1 in 5 people in America suffer from some sort of mental illness. 1 in 2 will over the course of their lifetime. And I make the argument that unless you're lucky enough to be wealthy and have access to treatment, you're not going to get the kind of care that you deserve. A big part of that reason we know is stigma. And that's where my other interest comes in, is that for me, this is personal. I'm 35 years old. For half of my life, I've been in therapy and on antidepressants and diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorders. And I started talking about that a few years ago when it became really apparent to me just how severe the stigma that surrounds mental illness is and how debilitating it can be, both internalized and forced upon people by others, as people with mental illness are assumed to be somewhere twitching in a corner. And for the vast majority of us, that's just not true. That's how I've kind of taken my advocacy in my public official realm. What I talk about more often than not lately has been the personal life, which is I started writing a fiction book, which has now been published. It's called Redemption, and it's a young adult science fiction book that in a summary, in a sentence, is about depression, anxiety, and saving the world. And it's kind of a sci-fi, not quite dystopian, but sci-fi space opera sort of book about a group of teenagers who find themselves on a spaceship and have to save the world. The kick being that the main character also has depression and anxiety disorders. So there's kind of two plots to it. There's the external trying to save the world bit, and then there's the character trying to learn to deal with his disease in the most extraordinary of circumstances.
Right.
So it's, and I mean, certainly mental illness is a topic tackled regularly in fiction. I was actually really surprised at how few people tried to bring it from it or tried to address it from a science fiction perspective. And that's been a little bit illuminating for me as an author.
Cool. So the thing that really strikes me when you talk about your book is that so rarely is the main character, the idolized, Disney character or in stories, is someone who portrays mental wellness or illness well. So tell us a little bit about this character and why you chose that. I'm really curious because I love that there is possibly the hero has a mental illness issue.
I kind of can't. So like I said, the purpose of this more than anything else was to kind of provide a little bit of insight into the life of someone who's mentally ill. So obviously the character's experiences are largely based on my own and frankly, the multiple other people that I've had a conversation with that have mental illness. And the purpose behind this was to not only provide insight, but I really wanted people to see what an anxiety attack looks like, to get a visceral sense of what it feels like And he used that experience to have a better appreciation for people who do have some sort of mental health problem. And it's, again, though, the book is also supposed to entertain. And one of the basic conflicts in any literature, really in life, is hero versus themselves. It has to, any mental illness story is going to be a story of growth and early or, sometimes regression. And I tried to show both of those pieces in the book.
Right. Tell us a little bit about how your personal experience got put into the book. Like, tell me how they mirrored each other.
Well, I've never been sucked through time to fly a spaceship, so that's where the fiction part came in, at least not lately. That was an interesting balance, and I run a blog too, and I've done some interviews and had some really interesting conversations with other authors. And I really found it interesting how so many of them who have also written mental illness stories have tried to avoid writing too much about themselves, because by and large, that wasn't my tact. I mean, obviously the book is not about me, but the experience, the insecure thoughts, the physical sensation of depression, the physical sensation of an anxiety attack, the way they fly out of nowhere, the way they abate, that was something I really wanted people to feel. And I imagine that it's very difficult to write something that you haven't lived with authenticity. And you can. It's just a harder thing to do. So by and large, I think the experiences are based on my own. I like to think, though, I won't say they're universal, obviously, but I know from talking with others who have read it that you read what I wrote about, and if you've had mental illness in some form or fashion, you can probably recognize some of the things that I've discussed in there. At least right. I hope you.
Right. I can only imagine. I know, like, Elizabeth Gilbert, who is an author that I love, she always says, if you want to get an insight into what it's like to be me, go read one of my fiction books. Because I no doubt in my mind that for me it's about fiction. Right.
I mean, the character, I recognize where the character is me. And the main character's name is Ash. And I recognize where he is me and where he's not. Again, I'm 35, the main character's 20. I don't even think it was me 20 years ago. I think in a lot of ways the character's not nearly as goofy as I am. And I think, and it's funny because I think because of his depression, I wrote him as having a very hard time letting go. So I certainly struggle with, but I don't think to the extent that he does. And I wouldn't want him to completely be me. I mean, that's not, then I'd write a memoir. That's not where you want to go completely. You need to fictionalize it a little bit and gain some separation so that you can write things that are maybe painful.
Right. Tell me more about that.
The character has to make mistakes. The character has to be in pain, be in uncomfortable situations. And if you write it as yourself, you might be more tempted to shield the character from pain and to make decisions. And I don't. I mean, the character in this book, regardless of the depression, all the characters in the book go through quite a bit and I think learn and grow. But they have to endure extreme pain in a lot of situations and a lot of conflict and a lot of painful and awkward conflict in order to do that. And that's not something I don't think I'd be able to do if it was me. I like to think, I hope that life did that. But when you write a book, you need to put your characters in situations that you maybe would never be able to handle. And so I didn't want to write him as Michael. And here's Michael going, beating the aliens and all of that. That's just not something, I don't think that would do the character or the reader justice.
Right. What is Michael capable of, the author, you, of course?
Yeah.
What are you capable of handling? A lot of the episodes we have are with interviews are about, like, we can do hard things and inspiring people that they can. And so, like, what can you handle? What have been the adversities that you've been able to be open about?
I think the illness in and of itself is one thing. And being open with that was easily the best decision I've made in my political career, maybe in my personal career, because I think it filled me with the sense of purpose that even as a state representative, as an elected official, I didn't have otherwise. But, and it's funny because, I mean, what does whether or not you're able to handle something really mean? Like, I remember sitting with my therapist when so I am in my third term, running for my fourth term now. I am unopposed. I had, in the 2016 election, somebody run against me, ran a very hard, aggressive campaign. And as you should, if you're running for office, you better be prepared to go all out or you're wasting everybody's time. And scared the heck out of me because I didn't know, I thought to myself, if I somehow managed to lose this thing, and obviously I didn't, but if I lose, I don't know if I'd be able to handle that. And I remember even thinking at the time, what does that mean? What, I'm going to curl up in a ball? You need to, I think the best thing that everybody needs to be able to quote unquote handle is the ability to be resilient. People need to know that you can fail and still succeed and live a good life, which again is actually something I really did try to drive home in this book, that even people with mental illness have real challenges and have the capacity to show growth.
Right.
And to live and still hopefully accomplish extraordinary things. Although it is a lot harder. Now, getting back to your original question, what can I handle? I think by living with this and still leading what I think objectively is a successful life, I hope, and one which makes a positive impact on people, I hope I've been able, I think that's as good as I could ask for.
Right. So what is it like for someone like you to speak? I'm guessing, I haven't followed all of your campaigns, but what is it like for you to stand up and talk about mental illness, your mental illness, in front of thousands of people?
That, in a weird way, and to answer that question, let me explain exactly the path that I kind of took to wind up getting here. So as I said, I've had this all my life. I ran for office, local city council in Allentown in 2009. I won, and I ran for state rep in 2012 and won. I've had those depression issues, and they've ebbed and flowed over time. I decided to go public with my story in a sense, what was a fluke. And I've never really hidden it. It just wasn't something I spoke openly about. But that changed for me in August of 2014 when Robin Williams killed himself. And I mean, like a lot of people who have had some sort of mental illness, I was really shaken by that, because you think of somebody that joyful and funny and powerful who had access to any sort of help he could have ever wanted. If he lost his battle, what's to stop that person from being me? So I was already very freaked out by it. And I happened to go on Facebook that day, and there was some schmuck that I was Facebook friends with at the time who posted something to the effect of, "Oh, so sad Robin Williams killed himself. He just didn't have enough faith in Jesus." And I remember reading that and going, what the hell is the matter with you?
Right.
And it wound up in a weird way being an epiphany for me, because I distinctly remember thinking, people really are this dumb. That's extraordinary.
Right.
And I was pissed off, and I fired off a couple angry Facebook statuses. And I remember turning to my wife and saying, maybe it's time that I start talking about it, about me, which is something I kind of wanted to do, just in a moment never really felt right. And that seemed like the moment. So I had a couple of angry Facebook statuses, and I woke up the next day at 5:30 in the morning. I was like, I'm out. Forget it. I'm doing this. And I wrote a op-ed for my local paper. And I was filled with righteous indignation about, this is who I am. This is who I've struggled with. This is what I've struggled with. There are real people like this. Did a quick research of statistics that I can now recite in my sleep. Sent it to my staff. I was like, yes, it's wonderful. Okay, great. Off it goes. So send it to the paper. And we're like, we love it, Mike. We're printing it tomorrow. It'll be online by the end of the night. I was like, oh, okay, great. Oh, God, what did I do? Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God.
A shivering hangover.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was, as soon as I was so pissed off, it didn't dawn on me what I was doing until I did it. And then I was like, oh, God. And, that's when the panic really set in. And I started talking to my friends if I completely lost my mind here. They're like, no, this is a wonderful thing. And it was, and it changed my life. My point is that really, even aside from that moment of panic, it never dawned on me what I was doing until it was done. And I was kind of floored by the impact that it had, even aside from me, but on others. As I joke, I now know the prescriptions of more people in my area than I ever dreamed. And I've been approached by so many people who shared their stories with me, or that of their loved ones, or therapists who told me that they were, using my story and stories that were to some extent inspired by it with them. And I realized the impact that a personal statement can make. Now, that was frightening. The most frightening thing I ever did with this, I've given a lot of speeches. Whenever I go to schools as a state rep, I always talk about myself from that perspective to remind people that, this is me too. And I have a lot of kids who are, come up and talk to me afterwards. But I spoke about it on the floor of the State House of Representatives once, and that was the most nerve-wracking speech I've ever given in my life. And I've given a lot of speeches. I've gotten pretty good at speeches, I hope. Or at least if I haven't gotten good, I've given a lot of them, so I don't really get nervous before I give speeches anymore. But that one I was a mess over, and it was the best speech I've ever given in my life, and maybe the most meaningful.
Is it on a recording?
Oh, yeah. If you go to YouTube right now and type in Mike Schlossberg mental health, it's actually, okay, let me rephrase that. It's Schlossberg on mental health awareness is the video.
Excellent. I'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, and it's probably the first one that comes up. And that was fun. And there's a few of them. I've spoken about the topic far too many times. But it's the first one that came up, and that's the speech I'll remember for the rest of my life. I'll remember the response of my colleagues, the overwhelmingly warm response. And I remember it in particular because they gave me such a warm response that it gave me hope for people speaking about their own journey. I've been floored by how warmly I've been received by this. And I've used that to encourage other people to tell their story.
Right.
Because if I got this warm response, any normal human being will too.
Right. So since then, do you feel like before then, so let's just sort of use government as an area. So do you feel like you're doing that has now given other people within that government sector, has it given them permission so that it's sort of like a domino effect? Have you noticed that by you being the person who basically shines the light on the issue, that others are doing that now too?
Not in government, but normal human beings in my area, yes. I will say that. I know what I've had people straight up tell me that because what I've done, like, all right, Mike, talk to me about therapy. What does it mean? And I know factually I have friends that have, gone into therapy because of what I've said and done in my openness. And I know a lot of people have told me that they've come out, quote unquote, with their own stories because of what I've done. Not so much in government. I did have colleagues tell me that they understood and that they had been through. They didn't want to talk about it publicly, and I certainly understand why. That's their prerogative. But it's been normal human beings as opposed to political schmucks like me who have done it more.
Right. Do you feel like, so this is beautiful. I'd love to, in a minute, have you tell me a little bit about how you then decided to write the book. And so the progression was that you woke up this one morning and you were coming from a place of advocacy and some anger, and you shared, and then from there the domino effect meant that other people felt they could share or that they gave themselves to go to therapy.
Yep.
Then before you started to write the book, what shifts, like you're this person who, quote unquote in the cultural world, like you shouldn't talk about mental health, right? Like none of us should.
Yep.
What was the next step? What was sort of like after that? So once you did this great speech, what was the response after you got all the warmth? Then
it became a question of two things. Like, okay, I've done that. I've come out, quote unquote. So first of all, from a legislative perspective, it becomes, what are you going to do about it? I've got this position of some societal and cultural importance. What am I going to do? I participated in anti-stigma groups. I was approached by a couple of colleagues who said we should form a mental health caucus and use that as a launching pad to get information out about mental health legislation and advocacy and anti-stigma work. So I did that. I've introduced legislation specifically geared towards anti-suicide initiatives for at-risk segments of the population, specifically college students and first responders. I actually just had an amendment to a bill pass that required the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation to consider adding a fence if there's a suicide hotspot to a bridge or some sort of ledge. Means reduction is a really important component of suicide reduction. So that's the first piece of legislative success I can point to. Now, that was in the legislative arena, and that's something I've continued to do and will continue to do, and I've been really excited by that. The book is completely, and I have to be, it's funny because for ethical reasons, I have to be very careful. Now, I'm talking to you now as a person, so that's fine.
Right.
But the book is something completely separate than my government office. That's something that I, on my own time and promote on my own time. That started when I was in a really bad spot. So I started writing the book in 2015. At the time, we were in a really bad situation in Harrisburg. The job had gotten really stressful because there was this massive budget shutdown. My wife, who is, my wife, she's my rock. She had just started a new school. She's a teacher. She was really struggling at this new school. So it was a hard time for both of us. We were both miserable, and I was definitely, the depression was there. And I remembered thinking to myself, when I was depressed when I was younger, I would write. Maybe I need to do that again. And I had this core of an idea. I even wrote a couple pages of it as a kid about a sci-fi book where a bunch of teenagers wind up on a spaceship and they're not sure why. And that was more or less where the idea ran out. But I came back to it. I was like, that's actually kind of an interesting idea. Okay. And I fleshed the rest of it out where a bunch of teenagers wind up on a spaceship and they have to save the world from a deadly plague, which is the basic plot. And I was like, this is interesting. And then I thought about some of the mental health stuff that I had gone through, and I realized there was an opportunity there to make the book stand out by making the characters stand out. So I folded in the mental health component, and I had a book, and I had a book idea. And then over about a 9-month or so period, I wrote it, and I wrote it bluntly, it was as therapy. It was highly therapeutic for me to write that thing, for me to write Redemption.
Right.
And I was pleasantly surprised by that. It just felt really good, and it gave me a creative outlet. And a lot of times as I have the different characters talking to the main one, Ash, about his depression, I think it's a piece of me talking to myself.
Right.
And I suspect that's something that a lot of people who have dealt with depression and written about it can understand. A lot of good art comes from depression. I hope that's the case for the book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what is it that you needed to hear? So you wrote this book, and I can't wait to read it. After writing it, what is it that you needed to hear? Can you share with us?
Yeah, and that's, at its core, it comes down to it's going to be okay. And that, I guess I can't even really say at its core, because there is a lot going on in it, just like there's a lot going on with any individual person with depression or any sort of mental illness. I think I needed to hear that you've been through these battles before. Continue to be resilient, and the moment fades. And then it'll come back, and then it'll fade again. Again, the first book is called Redemption. I actually do have the sequel completed. Hopefully we'll be going through editing in the near future. The sequel is called Resilience. And I think that was obviously very intentional, because I think all of us who have mental illness need to remind ourselves to be resilient.
Did you write that book to you too?
I think that one, yes. But I wasn't in nearly the same bad place that I was when I wrote Redemption. So that one, by the time when I was writing Redemption, I started Redemption around February or March of 2015, maybe even later. You know what? No, it was later. I started Redemption probably around May or June of 2015. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah. So when I wrote it, I was definitely not where I wanted to be emotionally, mentally. But I also hadn't quite realized that was still less than a year out of when I had started talking about myself and getting active. And I don't think I fully grasped yet that I was going to be one of the more prominent politicians in the state to go forward with this. So by the time I finished editing it, and when it started getting published and I started the sequel, Resilience, I felt a little bit more like, okay, I have a leadership role now. So now I'm not talking to myself as much as I'm talking to other people.
Yeah.
And in Resilience, and it's interesting that you asked that question, because now I'm thinking about it, there is definite no, that one wasn't as much to me. Because Redemption focuses a lot on the main character and on the situation from the main character's perspective. And Resilience, it starts to branch out more into some of the other characters on the ship and their stories. And actually, I would argue that the greatest strength of Resilience is that you really learn more about the other characters as opposed to Ash.
Right. What kind of emotions did you have to feel writing Redemption?
It's a good kind of emotions did I feel writing Redemption? That's a really good question. At this point, more than anything, gratitude. But when I was writing it, it was very different. I think there was a lot of introspection, because as I'm writing, I'm going, is this really how I feel? Or am I talking to me, or from my own perspective, or from the character's perspective? And I didn't always feel like I had a good answer, which is when things got a little bit more interesting. And I don't want to say sadness, but then I will say anxiety as I wrote some of the situations, as I tried to imagine myself in those situations, or as I tried to imagine any of the main characters. and definitely a good chunk of discomfort, which you should, because you grow to care about the characters, and especially me as the one who's theoretically controlling them. Although sometimes it feels like you don't know if they're controlling me or if I'm controlling them.
Right. And probably on top of that, that you're putting yourself out there on a different level than you had. I mean, to express yourself creatively, I'm sure, is an anxiety-provoking experience in and of itself.
And in that sense, I think my public career prepared me for that. When I started talking about my own depression and anxiety, I was good to go. Like at that point, writing about it from a creative perspective, from a fictional perspective, I didn't care so much at that point, because by then I knew, like, I always laugh about it because, if the entire world already theoretically knows my worst secret, and it's really not my worst secret, but knows my biggest challenge, then meh. What difference does it make if I talk about it from a creative perspective?
Right. Well, and maybe for the listeners, there's a really great point there, which is keeping it in silence means you have to manage so many other things as well as your disorder. But once you talk about it, it tends to, I don't know if the word's cross-pollinate, like it tends to like spread into that. It knocks out other issues. Like now you don't have to worry about socially like protecting yourself from people seeing that you're anxious, because you've already put it out there. And now you have permission to write creatively if that's what you want to do.
That is really true. I wound up laughing about it, and it almost became a running joke with my friends, like, oh, look at me, I'm sad. And I'm very self-deprecating. But it does make your life a lot easier. And again, it's not like my life is defined by depression, but it gave me a real sense of purpose in this job and in life, being an advocate for it. And you look at so many causes, the vast majority of people who, that's probably an exaggeration, but a huge chunk of people who are involved in some sort of nonprofit cause have been touched by it on a personal level. And that's why they're so passionate about it, because they want to prevent people from living the same pain. Now, for me, as I said, I'm a very lucky person. And I always have been, with the exception of really when I was very young, and then the first few months my depression accelerated. I always knew what I had. I've always had access to healthcare, to see a therapist, to get the medication that I need. And if I didn't have that, I would never be living the life that I have now. And maybe I would have killed myself at some point in my life. I'm certainly reasonably close to it at various points. But my job as an elected official and as an author and as an advocate needs to be to try to give people who have been in the same situation hope and the same opportunities that I've had. So that needs to be where I come from as an author and as a state representative and just as a person. And I hope in the long run that what I've done has not only helped other people, but has helped other people tell their own stories and given them the strength to do that so that they can then help other people. And then the cycle continues.
Right. Before we finish up, and I ask just a couple more questions, what advice do you give to those who don't have access at this time before the resources are put in place?
Yeah. I mean, depending on where you are, literally where you are physically, there's always going to be some office that you could call in government where you could say, look, I'm struggling. I don't have insurance. I need help. Who can I turn to? Who can I talk to? There are apps. There is always going to be a minimum of a social safety net. And often it's not enough. It's not. But at least getting yourself started on that journey can be helpful, and finding somebody to talk to.
Right.
That's an inadequate answer because we have an inadequate mental health system. Something I'm trying to change. And I wish I could say something more comprehensive. But the best thing I can say for people who really can't see a doctor, they can't afford it. If you can't see a professional, if you can find somebody to talk to, again, even if it's just on an internet forum as an absolute last resort, then that's something.
Right.
But if there's any way, the first thing you need to do is contact a professional, either in the medical field or in the government field, to point you to somebody in the medical field to try to talk to a professional and see what your options are. Because more often than not, if you need help, you may not find everything that you need, but you can find some.
Right. And like you shared,
just by sharing it with someone might take off some of the heavy load of shame and the loneliness. That might be that, that is the first step. I totally agree. And you're sort of a walking evidence of that. That once you share it, well, now you can write a book about it, or then you can, you could sublimate it in whatever way or express it in whatever way. I think that is really, really, really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So good. So let me sort of ask you more of a personal question. So now, where are you mentally? Not that you have to disclose anything that you're not comfortable with, but like, what does it look like for someone who's so high functioning? Do you still have dark days, and how do you handle them?
Yes, absolutely. And I should add, as a Democrat and a pretty liberal, progressive Democrat in America right now, there's no doubt in my mind that I have a good chunk of dark days because of the political situation we are in right now. And I face those by reminding myself you do everything you can, and then until you can't. I mean, you do what you can, and it's as simple as that. But there is no doubt, and I always try to drive this point home, that I do have dark days. More often than not, my days are good. A good chunk of them are bad. Some are situational, some are regular life. Some I know are worse because my brain doesn't process emotions, thoughts, or situations the way that I wish it did, the way that most people do. So yes, despite being very high functioning in type A and, maybe from an objective perspective, relatively successful, there's a lot. It does feel like there are things wrong in my life that shouldn't be, that are more wrong than they would be maybe for a normal person who didn't have depression. Everybody's different. I mean, for me, I would classify, I've been diagnosed with a major depressive disorder. I don't think I'm ever getting rid of this completely. And it sucks, but if this is what I have to deal with for the rest of my life, if it gives me a chance to help others, okay.
Right. So inspiring. Thank you so much. How can people find out and get your book?
So the book is on a few ways. For the standard Amazon route, it's right there. You can type in Redemption by Mike Schlossberg. People can find me on Facebook or Twitter at Mike Schlossberg. You can also find my website is MikeSchlossbergAuthor.com. I have a blog there. You can order the book directly from me as well, and then I can actually personally sign it. Yay. So, I'm not hard to find. So it's an occupational hazard.
Very cool. And just to finish up, what would be the one, again, you're a part of the We Can Do Hard Things series, which from my perspective is just to make people understand that the people who look happy might still be struggling. The people who you wouldn't even think for a second are having a hard time, they are. What advice would you give the listeners? What would you like to say?
From that perspective, I will tell a story. So as I said, my depression, I think it was always running in the background, but really exploded my freshman year of college, like it does for many, many people. It was a new environment, new situation, torn away from everything I knew and loved. My first week was the hardest at college, was the hardest week of my life. I was so homesick. I was so depressed. I spent huge chunks of time on the phone with my girlfriend at the time or with my parents. And I remember being on the phone and saying to my dad at one point, "Dad, nobody else is depressed. I don't see anybody." He said, "Mikey, where are you right now?" I said, "I'm in my room crying." He goes, "Yeah, that's where they are too." Mm-hmm. And I never forgot that because, of course, he was right. And my point from your perspective, from what you're talking about, is there are more people in their rooms crying than you would ever notice. And that's, for anybody who's enduring depression, their own mental illness right now, remember, you're not the only one. It's 1 in 5 Americans right now actively suffer from some sort of mental illness. 1 in 2 will over the course of their life. And just trust me on that. You're not the only ones.
Right. So beautiful. Thank you so much for
thanks for the opportunity.
Yes, I will add all the links in the show notes and actually stay in touch. I would love to hear about when Resilience comes out.
Thank you. And thank you very much. I really do appreciate the opportunity.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.